So we've touched on the marine-derived calci that we've incorporated in all of the new Pro Series feeds, but I want to touch on a second technology. It's called KemTrace Chromium, and it's the first product of its kind on the market. It's backed by 20 years of research in all different species, peer-reviewed research. So it wasn't just a research that was published in a magazine. This is peer-reviewed scientific journals, registered in over 35 countries, manufactured in America and sourced from US-based ingredients, which we know this year with the closing of the borders has been extremely important. It's chromium is a water-soluble, highly available organic source of this mineral. What does chromium do? It actually improves glucose utilization, and we'll get into that a little bit further. How does that benefit a horse? Well, every function in your body or your horse's body is actually fueled by glucose. Glucose is the energy source for life, as well as oxygen, but oxygen's not really an energy source. So we need glucose. It's going to help with the immune function. Horses with metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance, chromium is going to help there, but also with athletic performance, milk production. I mean, there's so many areas that glucose is used, and by adding chromium to the diet, we can improve that pathway. March of this year, KemTrace Chromium was approved by the FDA for use in the horses, and it's the first and only FDA-approved chromium source for use in horses. It's actually chromium propionate. Propionate is a volatile fatty acid that's created by the bacteria in the hindgut. So, as I've mentioned, I'm very visual, and this is my graphic to explain kind of how glucose and insulin work together, because we talk about insulin resistance often. If you've had a horse with insulin resistance, we talk about high resting or basal or blood glucose and insulin, and what does that mean? So how I like to describe it to people is we've got a door that's got a handle and a key, and a lock and a key, and we've got a person. Okay, so the key is insulin. The lock that key is going to go into is the insulin receptor. The door that lock is attached to, that's the glucose receptor. And the person that's standing on the outside of the door, that is glucose. So in order for glucose to go from one side of the door to the other, so from the outside of the cell to inside the cell, first we've got to get a key, and we've got to put that insulin into the insulin receptor, and then that insulin receptor is going to unlock the glucose receptor, and then the glucose, which is the person, is going to walk through the door. And what that looks like on an actual cell is this graphic here. In a normal cell, we've got the red glucose, little beads floating around. When we have a lot of glucose in the blood, the pancreas says, oh, there's a lot of glucose, we've got to secrete insulin. So it'll secrete insulin, and that insulin will fly in, and it's supposed to attach to the insulin receptors, which unlock the glucose receptors and allow the glucose to go into the cell. But in an animal with insulin resistance, the lock's broken, right? So we got all this insulin that's come to the party to try and help glucose get out of the bloodstream and into the cell, but very few of the locks are working, so the key just keeps hanging around outside. So we have then elevated blood glucose, elevated insulin. Sometimes these horses get hungry, they're overeating, weight gain. We've all seen those weird fat deposits on these horses, crest, back, tail, head, reduced energy levels. Obesity is one of the first things that we see, and obesity also is partnered with the systemic inflammation. And so a simple thing like rain rot or scratches on the leg can be exaggerated because they're causing inflammation, and then we've got systemic body inflammation, whole body inflammation that's compounding that and making it worse. So what might have been a simple rain rot on a healthy horse, on a horse with insulin resistance, is a nightmare because it doesn't ever seem to go away. The actual elevated insulin, all that insulin that's floating around in the bloodstream and not going anywhere, insulin is not meant to just float around in your bloodstream. So all of that insulin sitting around can also be causing damage. It can be constricting blood vessels. That can be one of the mechanisms to lead to laminitis. So we want to make sure that we don't have all that insulin floating around. Oops. So what I want to do really quickly is, this is a video that KemTrace has put out, and I think it really explains the role of glucose and insulin, and then the role of chromium to that little partnership as well. So I'm going to play it, and hopefully you can all hear it.
Animal nutritionists formulate diets to provide carbohydrates as an energy source for livestock. Using different digestive processes, cows and pigs convert these carbohydrates into glucose, which is ultimately released into the bloodstream. Once in the bloodstream, glucose can reach different organs in the body. When the blood reaches the animal's pancreas, beta cells inside the pancreas detect the rising glucose levels. To reduce the glucose level, beta cells release insulin into the bloodstream. As blood circulates through the animal, insulin and glucose exit the bloodstream into tissues to reach the animal's cells. Many of the animal cells have specific receptors on their surfaces that bind to the circulating insulin. Insulin acts like a key in a lock to open the cell by activating glucose transporters so that the circulating glucose can get inside the cell. The dietary trace element, chromium, is necessary to optimize the activation of the insulin receptor so that more glucose can get into the cell. A maximum of 4 chromium molecules may bind to one insulin receptor, which can lead to an 8-fold difference in insulin receptor activation. Adding supplemental KemTrace chromium propionate to the diet provides the additional chromium for insulin receptor activation. Chromium enhances this reaction, causing glucose transporter activation, allowing additional glucose to enter the cell. The additional glucose will allow for more energy to be available for proper cell function. Proper functioning cells can lead to a healthier, more productive animal.
Okay, so to summarize, we talked about insulin and how it binds to the insulin receptor and it allows then the glucose to go through the door. When you add chromium, think about it like your house has one door on the front of it. But now chromium is attaching and allowing us to have like 15 different doors. Actually, it's an 8-fold. So let's say 8 different doors on the front of our house. So now 8 different glucose molecules can go through the front door at the same time. So we're getting more glucose into the cell. That glucose can be used for performance. And what is performance to your horse? It might be a lactating broodmare who needs more energy to produce milk. It might be a growing foal who needs more nutrients to grow. It might be a racehorse or a horse that wants to go faster, and we know that glucose is going to feed those fast twitch muscle fibers. It might mean that we've going to improve the locks, the broken locks on an insulin resistant horse. So there are so many different ways that that extra glucose can get used. So adding chromium to the diet is a real game changer. So I mentioned insulin unlocks the door and adding chromium allows more glucose to get into the cell. When we think of specifically about performance or fast, high intensity performance. When we're doing lower intensity exercise, like hunter classes or trail riding or lower level dressage, where we're not doing anything at any speed, 42% of your energy comes from fat, and about 58 come from carbohydrates, your sugars and starches. But as you start to increase the speed and intensity of that exercise, the amount of energy source substrate being used from fat goes down and the amount of carbohydrates goes up. The other problem with horses is they don't recover very well, because we eat food, we break it down, it goes into it gets absorbed, and it actually gets stored as glycogen in the muscle. Then your horse goes and it runs a barrel pattern, or it does polo or a race, and it uses all the glucose out of its muscle cell, and then it's got to put it back so that it can exercise again. And that glycogen repletion is very slow in horses, and adding chromium to the diet actually can speed up that repletion of those muscles. So it decreases our fatigue. It increases the time it takes for a horse to fatigue, and it also decreases the amount of time it takes for a horse to recover from that exercise. Something else that we don't really think about often is that when a horse is stressed, that is going to release a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol, just like we talked about osteocalcin being a marker for bone development, cortisol is the gold standard measure for stress in horses. And if we see a rise in cortisol, it means that horse is increasing in its stress. But what that cortisol does is it signals to the body to shunt glucose or nutrients away from wherever it's currently being used and take it to the area that's stressed to try and minimize that stressor. So if we've got horses that are growing, that's going to be sacrificed. If we've got horses that are exercising, that performance is going to be minimized. So adding chromium is just going to allow your horse to have more glucose available for all the different areas that it needs to be used. And we know that stress comes in every different avenue to our horses.